Chapter 28 Into the Forest. The boys ran to the cottage without a word. Nia flung the front door open and ran to meet them. "Where's your grandfather? Where's Lily?" she demanded. Between breaths, they told her what had happened. She gave Janner a quick look of disappointment that cut to his heart. His stomach felt hollow and cold. There was nothing to do but wait. Nia said as much. Janner could tell she was worried from the way she stood with her back straight and her shoulders squared. The more frightened she was, the tougher she looked. Nia led the boys into the house, her hands on their shoulders. The brother sat on the couch in front of the empty fireplace without speaking for a long time. Janner's eyes roamed the room, and everything he saw reminded him of his little sister. Nugget's palette on the floor by the hearth, Lily's whistle harp on the mantel. He thought with shame about the many times he had been frustrated at his sister for slowing him down, as if it were any choice of hers to have been born with the twisted leg. He thought about the times he had teased her for making such a fuss over Nugget, the dog who had done a better job of watching over her than he had himself. He imagined her pretty voice filling the house with music, and he missed her. Janner slouched back in the couch and stared at the timbered ceiling, trying hard not to cry. Slarb flew through the air toward Lily, fangs bared in a vicious snarl. Too frightened to move, Lily forced away the thoughts of the fang's long teeth sinking into her, the poison coursing through her veins, and in that heartbeat she thought of the warm cottage, the only home she'd ever known. She was sad that she'd never get to see it again. Lily imagined Janner, Tink, Poto, and Nia standing on the front lawn waving to her, and she thought of Nugget. She hoped that Janner and Tink would remember to feed him and scratch his belly once in a while. Suddenly, Slarb's growl was cut short. Tremblingly, Lily opened her eyes and saw the fang's claws clutching desperately at an arm locked tight around his throat. She couldn't see the person's face, only a tuft of white hair sticking up from behind Slarb's shoulder. But the arm around Slarb's throat had a dirty, knitted sock pulled up to the elbow. Slarb's black eyes wheeled in their sockets. He scratched and dug into the socked arm, but it did no good. The arm held firm. Slarb staggered backward and turned away from Lily, revealing lanky Pete the Sock Man. He was either brave enough or foolish enough, and maybe both, to attack a fang bare-handed, or sock-handed, as it turned out. Pete's eyes were squeezed shut as he hung on desperately to the thrashing fang. Slarb's teeth were bared and oozing with yellowish venom, but his movements were slowing down. Lily began to hope that just maybe she would live to see her family and Nugget again. Pete was grunting, straining to keep his grip on the twisting beast. Though blood was soaking the sock where Slarb's claws were digging into Pete's forearm, he showed no sign of pain. Slarb spun around so fast that Pete's feet flew out from behind him. The fang lurched this way and that, his tail whipping the underbrush. Finally, he fell first to one knee and then to the ground, unconscious. Pete lay on top of Slarb, gasping for air. After a moment, he loosened his grip and carefully slid his arm out from under the creature's neck. When Pete saw Lily, he relaxed and stood up, brushing himself off as if embarrassed. Lily was still crouched down in the brush at the edge of the trees, looking warily at her rescuer. "Thank you," she said timidly. "That was very brave." Pete watched her without speaking, still winded from his struggle. She felt like she was talking to a scared animal, and her heart went out to him, much as it had gone out to Nugget when she'd found him as a puppy. Something about his face looked familiar, a thought that had never occurred to her before. She'd seen him bouncing through town, but she'd never really stopped and looked at the strange man before. She knew that he was prone to speaking gibberish to lampposts and attacking street signs, but she had never spoken to him. No one did. The Glipwood Township ignored him like a stray dog. Lily felt like she should have been scared, but she wasn't. Not only was there a fang that was still alive, lying just a few feet away, but she was at the edge of Glipwood Forest. She was also in the presence of a man who, though he had just saved her life, was supposed to be as crazy as the dark sea was dark. From Strawburns, the wide terrain. The dark sea of darkness was no darker than any other ocean I ever sailed over, so I'm not sure where it got its name. Unless maybe it's because of the feeling you get when you're out there in the middle of it. You feel like you might be guzzled up by one of the giant critters that live beneath the surface. It could get its name from all the storms that whirl up out of it and kick you and your ship around like a kid with a ball. Every night there's a fog that swallows up the stars and leaves you floating blind out there in the darkness. You get the feeling like you'll never make it home, and that even your best mates on the ship don't really know you or want to. Like they never noticed if you toppled over the rail and plopped right in. Come to think of it, maybe the water was darker than normal. Somehow, though, she felt a peace that surprised her. She hobbled over from behind the brush. Pete shrieked and scrambled backward. It's okay, Lily said, again feeling as though she were calming a frightened puppy. Pete's eyes darted to and fro like a trapped animal. She stopped in front of him and smiled up at the tall, ragged man. Is your name really Pete? His wild eyes finally settled on hers. She saw the jittery fear gone for a moment and detected a sorrow in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. He reached out a socked hand to touch her wild hair, and Lily suddenly felt afraid again. She hopped back a step, tripped over Slarb's tail, and fell hard to the ground. Pete withdrew his hand and gasped as if he had touched a hot coal. The wildness crept back into his eyes. Slarb groaned and strained to push himself up from the ground. One of his black eyes fluttered open and focused on Lily. She cried out and scrambled away, but Slarb wasn't going anywhere yet. Pete kicked him hard, slamming his scaled face back into the ground and knocking the Fang unconscious again. Then, in one sweeping motion, Pete stepped over to Lily and scooped her into his arms. But she saw with horror that Pete the Sockman wasn't carrying her home. He was taking her deeper into Glipwood Forest. Poto reined up his horse at the edge of the trees. He hadn't entered Glipwood Forest since he was a boy, when hunters and rangers had kept the dangerous animals in check. Now here he was, an old man with one leg and no weapon to speak of, in the forest teeming with all manner of hungry beasts. Nugget was panting, staring fiercely into the shadowy wood. Tharp's trail had been easy to spot. It led out of town, past several homes and farms. The closer Poto, Danny, and Nugget got to the border of the forest, the more the properties were run down and abandoned. Old fences slouched. Sad husks of homes stood charred and forlorn in the fields, where families once worked and lived and loved. These abandoned homes stood like gravestones scattered across the prairie. As he drove Danny northward, Poto thought back to his fine green years as a boy in Glipwood, long before anyone had heard of Nag the Nameless. The memories stung him and filled him with rage. Aye, Nugget, she's in there. Poto nodded in the direction of the dark trees, and patted Danny the cart horse's shoulder. I reckon we ought to go get our girl. He clicked his tongue, and Danny snapped into a gallop. Though dusk had settled on the Igby cottage, no fire burned in the hearth. No lanterns were lit. Janner, Tink, and Nia sat without speaking in the darkening house, waiting as they had for hours. Mama, Janner said finally. Nia looked up at him from their chair, where she'd been sitting with her head bowed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I lost her again. Janner couldn't continue without crying, so he looked away. Nia crossed the room and lit a lantern. She placed it on the windowsill, then sat down beside her older son. Hush now. It'll be all right. It does no good to worry over what's already happened. What matters is now. The past and the future are both beyond our reach. I'm afraid she might not come back, Tink said. You have to think hard about the very thing before you, dear. Nothing else. To think too long on what might happen is a fool's business. Right now, for your Poto, the thing before him is to find Lily, not to think about how it happened or who's to blame. The thing before us is to wait in this old cottage without giving up hope. Even if hope is just a low ember at night, in the morning you can still start a fire. Janner couldn't hold his tongue. Is that why you and Grandpa never talk about our father? Because the past is beyond our reach? Tears filled his eyes. If Lily never comes back, will you just pretend like she never existed, the way you do with Esben? Nia stiffened. Janner stared at the floor and fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. He hated the tension he felt in the room, but he couldn't apologize. He knew Nia was right about hope. He felt it in his bones, but he couldn't bear the way his mother and Bodo had buried the memories of his father, whoever he was. Janner. He looked up at his mother. She was a picture of strength. Her elegant jaw was set, her head was erect, and her posture firm. but her eyes were churning with conflicting emotions. She looked like she might at any moment burst into tears of either sorrow or anger. I know it's hard for you, but you have to trust me, she said. There are things you don't understand. He rolled his eyes and looked away, but she took his chin in her firm hand and turned his face to hers. One day you will know why we don't speak of your father. You both will, she added, looking at Tink, but he's been dead many years and your sister yet lives. I hope. Nia looked out the window into the near dark and put her hand up to her mouth. Someone's coming. Janner leapt to his feet and flung open the door. He saw the shadowy form on horseback making his way up to the path of the house. No one dared to breathe. Finally, Janner saw that it was indeed Poto on old Danny's back and Nugget trotting along beside them, but he couldn't tell if Lily was there. Janner had a dreadful feeling that earlier that day at Oscar's was the last time he would ever see his sister. Tink ran to meet his grandfather, and the others followed. When he was still a stone's throw away, they heard Poto's voice call out in the fading light. I've got her, he said. She's fine. Tink whooped with joy and ran to help Lily from the tired horse. Janner nearly collapsed with relief. He looked over at his mother, who was standing in the doorway with her hands folded tight at her chest. Her eyes caught the last light of the evening, glowing like embers smoldering long into the night.